So thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is John Weeks. As a member of the Friends of Multilateralism Group, I would like to welcome you to today's brainstorming session dedicated to the topic, how to address the subsidies challenge to the trading system. Normally, our CEO, Jean-Kun Liu, would make the opening remarks, but he is in China on important personal business and has asked me to do so in his stead.
Oh, you're in?
Yeah.
Open up, get what I've got on your...
It is clear to us at FMG that subsidies and other equivalent actions by governments have moved to the top of the list of measures that put market access for goods at risk, particularly in the largest markets. The past year has seen enormous sums spent by governments, and there's a serious risk that this trend will continue as more and more governments conclude that they must intervene to put their own producers on an equal footing with those of other nations. In the light of these developments, we concluded that it might be helpful if FMG were to organize on its own account, a discussion on this important topic. We have spoken with a cross-section of government representatives to the WTO who have told us that a discussion on this important matter organized by FMG would be welcome. It may well be that some governments see the value in studying and discussing this topic, but would prefer that such a discussion be at arm's length for now. After all, many governments are politically committed to investing in new subsidy programs to help various domestic actors in their economies, and might think it incongruous to be considering whether such actions might be harmful. After today's session, we at FMG will consider whether to organize further brainstorming sessions on subsidies, to dig deeper and to focus on subsidies in the sectors of industry, agriculture, fisheries, and services. Of course, on January 26th, FMG hosted a discussion on next steps in the fisheries subsidies negotiations. Subsequently, a session could examine existing international disciplines on subsidy practices, including in the WTO agreements. This examination could look at the no longer in force ASCM provisions in Article 8, which address non-actionable subsidies used in support of research, disadvantaged regions, and adaptation to new environmental requirements. Hopefully, this work organized by FMG will stimulate thinking in governments and elsewhere about whether some form of collective action would be desirable and what form it might take. We are most grateful to our four panelists who will speak today. All of them are well known to you and highly respected in the WTO community for their knowledge and abilities. Their biographical information is in the material you received with the invitation to today's event. Patrick Lowe, a vice chair of FMG and a former chief economist of the WTO for over 15 years, will lead off with a presentation on the economic considerations relevant to the topic. Anabel González, a deputy director general of the WTO, has vast experience, including having served as Minister of Trade of Costa Rica. She will describe the conclusions and recommendations of the joint report on subsidies prepared by the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, and the OECD. EU Ambassador João Machado has served in several of the most senior positions at the European Commission in Brussels. No stranger to Geneva, he was a member of the EU delegation in Geneva when the WTO came into being. Pimchanok Pitfield is the ambassador and permanent representative of Thailand to the WTO. She has had a wealth of experience, both in Thailand and abroad, dealing with global trade and economic issues. She too has previously served in her country's mission to the WTO. Our two ambassadors will be free to react to the first two presentations. In addition, it would be useful to hear how they see today's topic and what they think might be done to try to avoid what some have called a race to the bottom. To conclude our discussion today, we have allocated 40 minutes for you, the audience, to ask questions or make brief observations. When the time comes, please use the chat button to raise your digital hand, and I will recognize those wishing to speak in order. I now invite Patrick to make his presentation. And hopefully, Patrick, you're hearing me.
I'm hearing you. Are you hearing me?
Yes, very well. Thank you.
Great good fortune. I haven't changed my name, but my wife kindly brought her computer along, which seems to be working a bit better than mine. Anyway, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. I'm pleased to have been given this opportunity to talk about subsidies, although I have to say, it strikes me as a pretty complicated and involved issue, and we'll probably just scratch the surface a little bit. I want to start by thinking about the definitional challenges. You can have so many different definitions of subsidy that you can adopt. In the broader sense, a subsidy is like is like any other government measure that affects relative prices in an economy. It's an intervention that changes the conditions of competition within and or between jurisdictions. So possibly an all-encompassing definition could read something like any price-based or regulatory intervention that changes relative costs or returns in the market, nationally and or internationally, to the advantage of a subset of producers or consumers. So one economic agent's gain is another economic agent's tax. And these subsidy-like instruments can take any number of forms. If they're purely regulatory, they could be embedded in standards, technical regulations, labeling requirements, any number of things. If they're financial or fiscal, they could involve grants or tax breaks of some kind. They could involve the granting of exclusive rights to certain economic actors, reducing competition in the marketplace. They could be embedded in exclusive equity ownership arrangements, such as state-owned enterprises. This is the one area of the areas I've just mentioned that the WTO hasn't really touched on. The others, in various ways, are addressed. But the point here is that in terms of the problematic elements of subsidies and subsidy policies, there's plenty of scope for policy substitution. And it also encourages governments to think in broad terms and in broad definitions that haven't been agreed. So I think the current sources of tension, however, I think are more limited and more narrowly defined as in the WTO agreements. And this is really where I think a lot of the trade tension is mounting. The four key areas where explicit subsidy disciplines are relevant in relation to the current work of the WTO are in the SCM Subsidies and Countervailing Measures Agreement, the Agreement on Agriculture, the Agreement on Trade and Services. Services, which account for a growing share of GDP, and the richer a country becomes, the more dependent it becomes on services, and yet there's still only a placeholder in the GATS agreement on services, so on subsidies. So this presumably is something that needs further attention. There doesn't seem to be much success since 1995 in addressing this. Agriculture has always been a problem, remains a problem, and I think would need to be dealt with as an entirely separate set of issues, I think. So as far as I can see, most of the current tension relates to subsidies that could fall under the purview of the SCM. And here, subsidies are quite narrowly defined as financial contributions given by a government or other public body that confers a benefit. And any subsidy deemed specific in these terms is potentially either actionable or prohibited. So this brings us to the question where I don't think there's, unless you happen to be a bit ideological about economics, I think that you wouldn't demur from accepting that there are good subsidies and bad subsidies. Good subsidies clearly dealing with market failures, things like climate change, which are not properly addressed by market forces. So if there are good subsidies, what do we do with it? How do we manage them? The whole thrust of anti-subsidy provisions in the WTO is to minimize what are considered their distortive effects. Now, specificity is central to this notion of distortion. But for an economist, specificity is certainly not sufficient and may not even be a necessary condition for determining whether or not a subsidy distorts markets. It can be quite narrowly defined and still have significant potential economic costs, or for that matter, benefits in terms of its application. So this was something that this is not news to the WTO community, because in the 1995 agreement, the Article 8 really did recognize that specificity could be associated with non-actionability of subsidies in particular areas where markets were clearly going to fail. These included certain research-related subsidies, subsidies given to support disadvantaged regions, and subsidies to adapt existing facilities to new environmental requirements. Many of us at the time thought that Article 8 represented a step forward, a recognition that we needed to have a more subtle approach to subsidies than merely to say, you're subsidizing, I don't like it, I can fix you for doing that. So unfortunately, it only had a 5-year life. And for reasons that I never fully understood, there must be an interesting backstory here, either one of neglect or of opposition, that prevented the necessary explicit decision being taken to extend that provision. And I think that obviously is a problem. And I think if we're talking about what should be done, I think that's something that definitely needs to be reconsidered. So a particular tension today, I think, goes with the fact that a lot of those subsidies are being used with other measures which are actually regulated in other parts of the WTO, such as domestic content requirements, particular ownership relationships, particular locations, things that by local provisions, things that could be challenged. And so maybe there's some scope for that. Were it the case that there wasn't a kind of fairly generalized tendency to disregard WTO rules or to bother to exercise WTO rights, I think it's fair to say that there's no significant member of the WTO that isn't in some way or another out of compliance with its WTO obligations. I think this was started in a big way with the Trump measures on steel and aluminium, and it has persisted. And I think there's a sense that the WTO is not working. But if governments were so inclined, could such provisions be challenged? Well, they could on the GATT Article 1, a bit more difficult, and GATT's Article 2, a little more difficult with national treatment, but there certainly could be some challenges there if governments were willing to do it. But overall, the question seems to me to be what should we be doing? How should we be thinking about this? On the assumption that governments still think the WTO is a place where they can do business. So assuming a willingness to take the WTO seriously, do the rules need some revision? As I said, I think that we should think about an Article 8 approach to acknowledging that there are some subsidies which may be specific, but which clearly are necessary because markets are failing in crucial areas. Secondly, if subsidies can be deemed good in the sense of making up for market failures and capturing positive externalities, external effects that the market doesn't capture, should we not be finding ways of securing cooperative outcomes in terms of sharing subsidy costs of dealing with shared problems, such as climate change? I think there are a growing number of people who believe that if we don't get this right, we are playing with fire in terms of the onset of catastrophic climate change. Clearly, markets don't fix this. Clearly, we need international cooperation to fix it. So how is this going to happen, and who's going to step up to the plate? There is another interesting finding, actually, that comes out of Simon Evenett's work in the Global Trade Alert, which I think I take some encouragement from, actually. It's that when they looked at subsidies and subsidy practices and thousands of measures, they found a certain pattern. When one significant country started to do something, others tended to counteract it and do the same thing. Well, supposing that was done in a more cooperative way, doesn't it suggest the possibility of cooperation rather than uncoordinated counteraction and responses that generate tension and encourage supplementary protectionist actions to favour domestic interests? Surely, if there is an interest, if there is a recognition that we need to intervene in the marketplace to get the right solutions certainly from a climate change point of view, then surely this is not beyond the wits of governments to manage by having a serious look at what kinds of subsidies can be thought of as good, what else would be needed, and how to avoid the use of these as secondary use of these as measures to protect domestic industries, all in the name of trying to fix the climate. In order to fix the climate, it is not a necessary condition that you discriminate against your trading partners. So with that, I think I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Measure.
Thank you very much, Patrick.
So we're still in my.
You've definitely given us a sense of the complexity of the problem. So thank you for that. And I now turn to our next speaker, Anabel González.
Thank you very much, John. And I am delighted to be here in this discussion with so many friends and colleagues. This discussion on subsidies and international trade is indeed timely. We are seeing increased activity, and in some cases, increasingly worrisome dynamics around subsidies. Now, John asked me to give an overview of the joint report on subsidies issued by the WTO, the IMF, the OECD, and the World Bank. So that would be the focus of my presentation today. And I will also use this opportunity to say a few words on the follow-up work between the four organizations. Now, before I go into the substance of the report, I wanted to highlight that the report has been very well received by many governments. Most recently, it received support following a presentation on the margins of a meeting of the WTO Committee on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures in October last year, and a meeting of the IMF Executive Board in December of last year. So to me, this reveals an appetite, especially I would say from advanced economies, to at a minimum have some evidence-based analysis and dialogue on this very complex issue. And I think it is fair to say then that the report achieved its stated goal of serving as a conversation starter. And that conversation, of course, is needed more than ever. Now, to be sure, we know that subsidies have long posed a challenge for global trade. Patrick was referring to this point, but I think that the challenge somehow has become more acute and the need to address it more urgent. Because if taken too far, the use of distortive subsidies could have unintended consequences, including of corroding the rules-based trading system and undermining the stability and predictability that have enabled trade to flourish and become a major source of prosperity over the past several decades. So the four authoring organizations have what amounts to a duty of care, if you will, to the rules-based trading system. And that is at the core of our decision to collaborate on subsidies, starting with this report. So our decision to address this issue and to do so now also has a lot to do with the growing interaction of subsidies with mounting and urgent global challenges, from climate change to digitalization, and from resilient supply chains to emergency support. And each of these challenges creates new demands for public investment. And each of them calls for better understanding of how public resources can contribute to global public goods while minimizing distortions to global markets and harm to others and to the natural environment. The four organizations have accumulated valuable experience on subsidies from the lens of our respective institutional mandates. So we felt that the time was right to pool our forces to offer an integrated and coherent picture of subsidies and their role in meeting today's global challenges. Though information on subsidies is patchy, the report identifies some clear patterns. And let me highlight two broad points. First, we know that subsidies are an important and positive tool to correct market failures. And again, Patrick was making a clear reference to this, including to accelerate the adoption of green technologies and help businesses and households during economic and health emergencies. But in practice, there are many examples of subsidies that do little to achieve their intended goal, or that do so at an unnecessarily high cost for the domestic economy, the global environment, or other countries, which means that design matters. If not carefully designed, subsidies can distort trade and investment flows, erode the value of tariff findings and of trade commitments, and undercut public support for open trade by feeding the perception that international competition is not even-handed and that the international playing field is tilted towards those who follow, against those who follow the rules. Add to this the risk that subsidies in one country will trigger subsidies in others, giving rise to a subsidy race, and you arrive at a lose-lose formula for more trade frictions and potentially more fragmentation. Second, we know that subsidies are on the rise across sectors and countries. And in fact, they are the most frequent form of economic policy intervention after the financial crisis of 2008, as Simon and his work in the Global Trade Alert has shown. And here in this graph, we see this very clearly. Now, it's important also that I would say probably moreover, we see that many sectors benefit from subsidies. For example, government disbursed $447 billion to agriculture each year from over 2008 to 2020. Fossil fuel support is estimated by OECD at over $350 billion. And by some estimates, more than half of global trade in goods occurs in products and markets in which at least one subsidized firm operates. Beyond that, there are many gaps in our knowledge, along with strongly divergent views on the role and impact of subsidies. And WTO members, as we all know, do not see eye to eye on central questions such as what is a good subsidy or what are the negative spillovers from subsidies. And of course, we all know that finding common ground on these questions is even more difficult by debates about the coexistence of different economic models within a single rules-based trading system, as well as debates about special and differential treatment. Which brings me to the issue of WTO subsidy rules. So the report provides what I think is a useful primer on existing multilateral rules on subsidies, including in agricultural, industrial goods, and services. And the bottom line is this. Existing rules have overall served WTO members well for over 2.5 decades. And as part of a broader system of trade rules, subsidies disciplines have underpinned decades of trade-led growth and prosperity around the world. More importantly, the rules provide a strong basis for regulating subsidies going forward. And yet, it is also true that over the past few years, many new and unforeseen challenges have emerged. And that has prompted debates at the WTO and elsewhere about the role of subsidies and whether global subsidy disciplines need to be updated and strengthened. And answers to this and related questions have big implications both for the future of trade and of the WTO. So let me just say a word on each of these challenges. First, climate change, again, a point that was discussed by Patrick, which is that given the likelihood of positive externalities from clean energy innovation and economies of scale, and the urgency of tackling greenhouse gas emissions, there may be a strong support for stepping up public investment as part of an ambitious green policy package to accelerate the transition to a net zero economy. Now, this raises difficult questions and trade-offs between short-term market distortions arising from green subsidies on the one hand, and on the other, minimizing negative spillovers and promoting market competition in the longer term. We must also pay attention to the environmental consequences of existing subsidies. And we have a good sense of the scale of fossil fuel subsidies and their environmental harm. So a strong case can be made for strengthening WTO rules to remove or reform them. Now, the success of WTO members in reaching an agreement to curb harmful fisheries subsidies is testimony to the potential for additional progress in this area. Second, we have the digital transition. And in the context of a winner-takes-all digital market with high-scale economies, industry concentration, and powerful network effects, there's strong temptation to use subsidies as industrial policy to create, support, or protect national champions. And that, of course, can undermine competition and cause distortions to the global level playing field. At the same time, there may be instances where subsidies may be appropriate to stimulate competition, inclusiveness, and consumer welfare in digital markets. Third, emergency support. We know that support measures that are highly effective in crisis situations may be counterproductive over the longer term, which means that they should be phased out before distorting competition, undermining innovation, and fostering inefficiencies that harm global and domestic markets. Fourth, supply chain resilience. Governments are increasingly active in seeking and often subsidizing the creation of alternative sources of supply and production for key inputs to recent shocks that have exposed supply chain vulnerabilities. There's a case to be made for diversification as a tool to manage risk, and many companies across the world are, of course, doing this. That said, government action, including distortive subsidies that makes efforts to enhance the security of supply chain with the adoption of strategic industrial policies may pose some challenges. And if taken too far, it could actually lead to increased concentration of risk and reduce resilience. So this is another area where updated WTO rules could play a role. And fifth, state-owned enterprises and the role of the state. With SOEs becoming more internationally active, the report states that there are many questions about the effects and international spillovers of SOE-related subsidies and what that means for a level playing field and for WTO subsidy rules. So, moving on to the last issue I want to address, I want to refer as to how can the four organizations cooperate better to move the dialogue on subsidies forward. So the report concludes with a commitment to work together among the 4 organizations and with other relevant partners. That commitment enjoys strong support from our 4 executive heads. And at the high-level event to launch the report in April 2022, the heads of the WTO, the IMF, the OECD, and the World Bank said loud and clear that they strongly supported focused, practical, and coordinated action on subsidies by their 4 organizations going forward. Now, a priority area is the need to have better information on subsidies. That means we must up our game when sharing existing information, identifying data gaps, and filling those gaps. And we must up our game also in coordinating among ourselves to establish data collection priorities and tasks. And we will need to involve other institutions and then disseminate the results of our efforts in ways that are easily accessible and user-friendly. So as a first step, the 4 organizations have decided to set up a joint online portal for subsidies data that provide links to existing data sources from each organization. The portal will provide a descriptive narrative that explains the different types of data available, the structure of the different databases, and detailed descriptions of their content and their underlying data collection methodology. A portal prototype will be launched at the upcoming IMF World Bank spring meetings. We then plan to expand the portal to include other features such as searchability across databases and others. And we're also planning to assess the suitability for inclusion in the portal of third-party data. So once we launch this portal, I look forward to receiving comments from you and from your networks, of course, on how to improve and expand the portal once it is made public next month. Now, with improved and coherent data, we can then bring the full analytical firepower of the 4 organizations to develop a better understanding of the actual effects of subsidy programs, to what extent they can achieve their stated objectives, and at what cost, and what are the impacts on other countries. So that's priority number 1, to improve transparency and analysis. Priority number 2 is to feed sound evidence and analysis on subsidies into dialogues across and within countries. And each of our 4 organizations have several forums to discuss a broad range of essential issues, from improving existing subsidy schemes to minimizing their negative spillovers, and from assessing their budgetary implications to measuring their environmental impacts. So it is critically important for governments and for stakeholders to make full use of these discussion spaces, as this could drive more constructive actions on subsidies. So in the WTO, I won't go into detail. There is some discussion in the area of subsidies that has gone into certain specific topics. But of course, there is also an issue with the lack of transparency on subsidies, particularly on the record of subsidy notification. Now, some WTO members are trying to garner support to step up work on subsidies at the WTO. And I imagine I see we have the EU ambassador, one of our discussants. The EU recently presented a proposal to strengthen the deliberative function of the WTO, including for further dialogue in this area. Discussions are, of course, also taking place outside of the WTO. So there seems to be some kind of appetite for increased dialogue in this area. Let me conclude by welcoming the FMG's interest in deepening its discussion and role on these very important issues, because we need to find constructive ways of dealing with subsidies if we want to safeguard and keep improving the rules-based system. And I think FMG, with all its experience, knowledge, pragmatic outlook, and particularly strong commitment to seeing the WTO succeed, is a great place to have this conversation. So thank you very much, John, and I look forward to the discussants' views and questions and answers as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anabel. And I must say, we really welcome this report you've given us. It's very impressive, this work that's been done by the 4 organizations. And it's an excellent contribution to further discussion on the subsidies issue. So I now give the floor over to Ambassador Machado. João, we can't hear you. You're on mute.
I think it's better now. Okay,
Yes.
Thank you. To you as well, I want to extend my thanks to the FMG group for extending me the invitation to be here today and discussing on this very important topic. I also want to thank Patrick and Anabel for their presentations, which set the scene extremely well. First, the European Union welcomes very much the work that is being done and the report that was issued by the 4 international organizations, WTO, IMF, OECD, and World Bank. We really look forward for this collaboration to continue in the field of subsidies, which I think can provide us with very useful input and analysis. This topic, subsidies, is indeed very important for the reasons you explained at the beginning, John, and is certainly not going away. Now, for the EU, a key consideration, which was, of course, touched by Anabel, and probably the first consideration that we need is the question of transparency. There are a lot of information gaps, and filling those gaps is a basic requirement, in my view, to have meaningful policy debates, and eventually later on to move on to negotiating agreement. But for policy debates to be useful, everyone needs to be transparent. And so that we can understand what are the top type of measures that are out there, and then through discussions to see what is the best way to design such policies and subsidies so that it minimizes impacts on other partners or other stakeholders. So in order to have a meaningful engagement, the first condition is information, transparency by members, and one of the first hurdles is the attitude of many WTO members that say, I stay by my notifications, even if people already provided the notifications that are in the books, that will already be good. But then there is resistance because it's burdensome if you have to increase the level of information. But I think we need to address that. Secondly, I think the report of the 4 IOS rightly underlines that the current rules, at least the ones in the WTO, are not sufficiently effective to tackle the distortions caused by state interventions. And there is a need for more action to address these concerns and to address today's challenges that is behind the amount of subsidies that are being lashed out these days, which is the green and digital transitions. So the findings that come out of that report, in my view, provide a very solid basis for engagement of discussions within the membership. Now, as Anabel mentioned at the end, the European Union has submitted very recently, last month, a submission to the General Council, to the WTO membership, to engage and to enhance the deliberative function of the WTO, which in our view is missing. And one of the key areas is precisely state intervention in support of industrial sectors or industrialization. So we are starting promoting that topic, and we will discuss again at the next General Council. But in our proposal, we are not limiting state intervention just to subsidies. At some point, we need to enlarge the discussion. It needs to consider wider policies, and there are very different ways of intervening, interventions by the state in support of industry or industrialization. So probably subsidies could be a starting point, but we need to address another set of instruments that are used by governments. Of course, the difficulty, and that's what we are trying, and myself personally, is to engage in deliberations in the WTO is not always very easy. First, if you want to address a wide area of interventions by states like these, the first thing that arises is in which forum. And that can be a terrible hurdle. Where do we discuss this? Certainly the General Council is not the best, is not the forum for this, because it's more political and you make a statement and that's it, you have no interaction. Of course, you have the ASME committee, but if you go to the subsidies committee, it's automatically drawn into compatibilities, compatible, not compatible, and that's not the sort of discussion that we can have. If you want to have a fruitful discussion, we need to move away from this compatibility discussion, which happens in many of the committees, because in part they are interested with the management of an agreement beyond it. So automatically the discussion moves to questions legal compatibility. We need to find a way where we can have a real deliberation among all members on these questions. And the deliberations should start with a factual basis, like Anabel explained, and the report of the 4 organizations starts that, and then move on. What is the best way to design such measures? For example, as Patrick said, if there is a market failure and governments need to intervene, what is the best way to design measures that minimize impact or negative spillovers to other WTO members, and while paying attention or to the objectives of fulfilling the green transition and the digital transitions, which are the great priorities of government, at least a great majority of governments. So we need also to consider how interventions by the state on industries, industrial sectors, how can it promote development? And there are also discussions by a group of developing countries in the WTO that want to discuss precisely this, how the current rules, unfortunately, often the debate is turned from the outset that current rules hinder development. So we need to flexibilize the current rules. I think the current rules were designed in a different world, in a different era. They were designed last century. They are not up to the task of addressing the issues of 2023. So we hope through these, we say very clearly, we are not looking for rulemaking, and I don't believe that in the current geopolitical situation and geoeconomic competition, that rulemaking in such an area can be a very promising avenue, at least for the coming years. But what we need is to start a dialogue, understanding, and probably with a better understanding and good deliberations, governments will feel more comfortable to move to the next step, which is what are the gaps in the rules, or can we fill those gaps in the rules to address the green transition? For example, several of you mentioned the question of Article 8 that had a lifespan of 5 years and expired. While one could think, given the priority that every government, and rightly so, in my view, pays to the climate challenge, which is a humanitarian priority, would it make sense to create a green box in ASEM? I mean, there are things that could be considered. But I think it's premature to move there. We need first to start from the basics. Look what is out there, what sort of measures are being given, and then move eventually as we gather support and consensus to a next phase. I will stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I must say, your description reminds me to a certain extent of my own experience in Geneva over the years. And I'm well aware that you can't just start negotiations on anything, really. It requires a very long process of dialogue and getting people to think about the issues and how they might be affected by them and so on. And you know, in my own experience, I recall we really started preparations for the Uruguay round, I guess, in about 1980. And we know that didn't finish till 1995. Things may be even more complicated today. But I think if we don't start some kind of discussion about these sorts of issues now, we'll never get to the point where we can have a negotiation or consider whether changes are required. So I think people should feel comfortable that we start a dialogue now. It doesn't prejudice anybody in terms of what may eventually transpire, but it's definitely a topic worthy of discussion. So thank you very much. And Ambassador Pimchanok Pitfield, please, over to you. Another Geneva veteran. You're on mute. None.
Thank you very much, Ambassador John Week. I'm not as far back as the start of the Uruguay round, so I was at the end of the Uruguay round. I established the WTO era. But anyway, I have 7 minutes, so I was going quickly. Actually, I prepared some of the notes, some points that I want to deliver, but I have heard, I think my main task is to respond to previous speakers. So I would try to do so first, and then if there are some time left for me, I may share a few things that how I see the debate on subsidies should be moving on. First of all, of course, thanks for the invitation, and it's a great honor to be with such distinguished panel. I would like to, I think both Patrick and DDG Anabel and also Ambassador Machado have pointed out to the same thing, conclusion that first we need to have more evidence, we need to have information, we have to start dialogue, and we have to get a clearer picture of what subsidies are, where they are, how they are used, and how distorting they are doing to the global trade. I fully share the viewpoint on that, and I think the things that have been written out in the report of the WTO, which I have finished reading here, DDG. I think they have come up with a very good starting point. But if I may go forward, I think not only talking or gathering information from international organization, maybe we need to think about our own mechanism, not only to notify, but to monitor, you know, have I don't want to go as far as say have like TPR review, but maybe we have some government support review on that to make it even more forthcoming, you know, for members to come with the relevant information, not only from the international organization. And if I may say, I think many of the government policies can be screen from like a budget, things like that, you know, talking as a government officials. Anyway, so the first point I agree, but maybe we can go a little bit further to institutional some mechanism to do so. The second issue I would like to respond is that I think I share very much Patrick's point that government support or assistance, not only financial stuff. For me, this new kind of era, the new kind of problem that we are facing, climate change or digital transformation, this call for even other non-financial support as well. But I think the topic today is not covering that kind of non-financial assistance, but I would like to highlight here from my own on-the-ground experience that we should think about assistance in terms of other measures as well. R&D, technology, help transfer, that kind of stuff. I will talk about it later, but I think that we should not forget about that. On the services discipline, Ambassador Haran knows very well, like me, that it could not take off. And frankly, I don't see it taking off now. You see money given to UBS Bank to help buying Credit Suisse. Is that a subsidies for services? It's so big, it affects everybody around the world. But of course, the Swiss government could say that this is to save the whole financial, the whole economy, basically, not to fall down. So I think for services, it might be a little bit difficult, but we could, I think we have some immediate things to look at. And I share with DDG Anabel and also Ambassador Machado that there are new emerging issues that subsidies will have to be adjusted to take care of them. DDG talk about all those challenges already. The way I see it is that new types of new policy objective for subsidies are to protect global commons, climate change, environment, greening the economy. Secondly, is to help in emergency or humanitarian purposes like the pandemic, famine, natural disaster. And thirdly, more subsidies are used for shoring up competitiveness or keeping up level playing field. The way I think is most important is digital transformation and technology development for many countries. And last but not least, and this is very political, is that subsidies are used to protect national security or promote strategic sectors. I don't have to specify which policies, but so I think it is true, and I share with Ambassador Machado and even Patrick, and maybe even DDG Anabel, that it is time we have to take a look at subsidies again. And Article 8 is a good starting point. Maybe I would chime in here to maybe give some thoughts about how I see the future subsidies could talk about, even though Ambassador Machado said maybe we shouldn't go that far. We don't even know where to talk about it, but maybe there are some things that I would like to see in the future of discussion of subsidies. I think for me, subsidies, as a long-time government official, Ambassador John, I don't like subsidies. They're like monster, and they make farmers and entrepreneurs weak. And but it's a populist tool. But I'm a realistic policy maker, so I know it will never go away. But the thing is, how do we live and use this so it would not become a big monster or big fish and harm other people, So the kind of subsidies that we have to have the rules in the future. First, it should be, we should try to encourage non-trade distorting subsidies as much as possible. Maybe with something like proportionality kind of way of thinking. Secondly, I agree with Ambassador Machado. We need to add flexibilities to help deal with a current world situation. For example, and this is, I'm not talking as Thai ambassador because these are my personal view, non-actionable subsidy for humanitarian emergency, but maybe it needs to come with conditions so it will not be endless. Thirdly, maybe we should provide greater and more practical S&DT provisions, not only for time. And sectoral guidelines, I think my basic thought is that just like you, I don't think the basic rule is bad. I think they are okay, but we need to just modernize and upgrade the rules a little bit to be in line with the current world situation. My time is running up already, so I would just go with wording on development dimension. And on this, I found Patrick's comment that maybe we should check costs of subsidies, or we should be responsible. And also Anabel's raised that in the report says quite clearly that subsidies are not only country specific anymore, especially if your economies are closely related to others. I would say, why don't we look at sharing benefits of subsidies, not only sharing the cost. For example, when a country subsidizes for battery for EV cars, or subsidies to help with digital transformation. But these technologies, they are not given to developing countries because they are protected by patent. I'm not saying that we should do away with patent. No, that's not my approach. But how do we in the future address okay, the subsidies that you provide, you're the big fish, you have deep pocket. How can you make sure that the subsidies are not doing harm to other people and let other smaller countries be able to compete as well? So there are many ways that you can share benefits of subsidies, but I think that I don't have time here. Maybe I will stop here, and I'm just saying that I think subsidies, even though I don't like it much, but it can be a benevolent tool. So let's make sure that the future rules of subsidies come in the way that encourage people to do good rather than tell them what not to do and to prevent them from doing bad behavior. I think the rules can be done both ways, like DDG Anabel says. So thank you very much, and sorry to be over time a bit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I must say that was an excellent presentation. Your comments and suggestions were very pertinent. I can see that Thailand is very well represented at the WTO. Now we've now reached the point where we're going to open our discussion session. And while we wait for members in the audience to put up their flag, let me first give a brief opportunity for our four panelists if they have any questions or comments they'd like to make in terms of what's been said by their counterparts on the stage this morning, the digital virtual stage. If not, I see we have Alan Wolf waiting in the wings, and no doubt he will have some observations that will get us started on the discussion period. So Alan, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. This is a brilliant FMG presentation. I congratulate you, John Weeks, and the four speakers. My hope is that a very broad net is cast for getting the transparency information that the speakers have emphasized. In other words, listening to Patrick, there are probably quite a few academics out there, economists and others, who would have a lot to offer on what should be looked for, not only solutions, but what is out there. The WTO dispute settlement system spent I think it was over 14 years on Boeing Airbus. What do we learn from that? There's a lot more air transportation today, which is moving trade, as a result probably of those subsidies. Within the Peterson Institute, which I'm currently virtually lodged in, there'd be a difference of opinion as to whether it was a terrible thing for Airbus, for the EU to bring along Airbus to be a competitor to Boeing, or it's a great thing. But that's looked at as air transportation, not as benefits to the world. One of my colleagues has suggested coordinated subsidization of vaccine production, for example, for the inputs into that are needed, hypodermic needles, that sort of thing, in a treaty on fighting pandemics. And we don't know what the next needs will be of the next pandemic, but I would hope that the four international organizations would invite in academics, the private sector, anyone who could contribute substantively to attacking the problem at the broadest point first, and then winnow it down to things like green subsidies and the like, categories that require more attention than other categories. Toleration of cartel activity, toleration of anti-competitive practices, government procurement, the whole range of things. But I think starting out by casting a broad net would be useful. And again, I thank the speakers for this program.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alan. I'm not muted. And does anyone else wish to chip in at this point, or should we ask our panel to react to the suggestions that Alan has just made? I see Jonathan Freed, former colleague of mine, and still a colleague.
Still a colleague and still a student of yours. So thank you, John, as Alan said, for your initiative in organizing this and what may prove to be a very fruitful follow-up. I have three observations, in effect, questions for the panelists possibly to respond to. Number one, to underscore the fundamental importance of transparency that Anabel highlighted. And I think looking back at recent history, there are lessons to be learned from initiatives in the recent past. Many of you will recall, and Cecilia was deeply involved at the time, in the global initiative to address on a global basis excess steel capacity. A very specific sector, a very circumscribed and well-defined universe. And what was called for was borrowing from disarmament negotiations, a ratcheting down of subsidies that would not change anybody's relative market position, but would reduce in each country the overall level of subsidization in a manner that would stabilize prices and enhance security of supply, anticipating some of today's debates, and so on. It foundered for a lack of transparency. Certain countries were not forthcoming, and it wasn't just China. We had Turkey, we had South Korea, and others. And secondly, no one's mentioned this yet, the pervasiveness of subnational interventions. And thirdly, as Patrick emphasized, the notion that income foregone or financial instruments, which are not the purview of trade ministries, but of treasuries, are that much harder to get at. So as Anabel says, unless you have a more comprehensive picture of what's at stake and have a negotiating modality that might be less threatening, you're not going to get very far. And even if you do, as the Global Forum suggested, and it had the participation of the WTO, the OECD, the 4 organizations, it still didn't get anywhere. So for those optimists who think all we need is a dialogue, I think he or she who doesn't read history is doomed to repeat it. We shouldn't delude ourselves into how massive a task may present itself. Secondly, there is a fundamental disconnect, and Patrick, you didn't comment on this, in the structure of the SCM agreement. US motivated, oriented towards exporting market access or importing market access on a fair and level playing field. The entire framework of the disciplines get at export impact without quite getting at barriers to entry, domestic subsidies to industry, and some industry that doesn't export at all, but in effect, by being subsidized, inhibits the ability of others to enter on a level market basis. So coming right back to the nature of the definitional issue that Patrick identified, in effect, I would argue a truly comprehensive approach needs to overcome this bias in the framework. We did make some steps in that direction in the Uruguay round, although the threshold for import damage is very high and very hard to prove, a 5% threshold to even get through the starting gate. So all of which is to say, I welcome and agree wholeheartedly with many of the analyses and observations. and in particular, John, your caution that it is a long road ahead. And if I'm not incorrect in paraphrasing the Chinese proverb that every long march begins with a first step, I'm glad you're taking it here. So thanks, and I welcome any comments.
Well, thank you very much, John. Very helpful. And this is, I think if we're going to go anywhere, this requires involvement by a lot of people. But if we can sort of at FMG perhaps help stimulate some new thought and discussion in a way that doesn't directly engage governments in a WTO discussion, which I know can sometimes be problematic, perhaps we'd be doing a good service. Ambassador Mina, good to see you, and please, you have the floor.
Well, thanks a lot, John, and thank you all for this very informative discussion. I think you said at the start, John, this is an issue that is coming onto the agenda here in a big way in the WTO. I'd like to suggest that it needs to certainly be on the agenda here at the WTO with research analysis of the sort that Anabel and the 4 big international organizations are working on. Absolutely. We need more analysis, more transparency, as Alan and others have said, and a hell of a lot more sunlight shed on this problem of global subsidies in international trade. Because as Anabel said, this is now by far and away the biggest of the trade policy instrument problems facing world trade. But I want to say that that's not enough. And there's a degree of sort of very important academic inquiry about this topic here amongst we informed insiders. But I reckon we've got to break outside of this network of important policy scholars and start to bring the subsidies problem into a broader sphere, because there are a couple of platforms that are burning at the moment. The first platform is, I would postulate, the orderly and fair conduct of international trade itself through the global trading system. And the size of initiatives such as those we're seeing in the United States and those being contemplated in North Asia on semiconductors and those that are being considered in the European Union, the size and scale of the industrial subsidies agenda is such that it will have an outsized impact on global trade distortions that could send us back into a subsidies war of the sort that we saw in the 1980s on agriculture, and could deepen very considerably. So that's one problem. And another problem, of course, is the growing impact on agriculture and the planet. And if anyone's been listening to Johan Rockström from the Potsdam Institute lately on planetary boundaries, and getting a sense of the size of the importance of agriculture to planetary boundaries like climate change and water, and listening to him about what $800 billion of agricultural subsidies does to the planet annually, this is another burning platform, another urgent problem, and burning literally. I mean, this is the 800 billion, according to the UNEP, is having an extraordinary impact on climate change. So whether it's in industry or whether it's in agriculture, we've got to bust out of the normal trade policy mode here and start to put this issue on the agenda of political leaders, climate leaders, environment ministers, and anyone who cares about the stability of the global trading system. I think it's got to be a conversation that engages all of our political leaders, because it is having as I say, an outsized impact on not only the stability of the global trade regime, but also on agriculture and the planet. It's an urgent problem, and I think it deserves a lot more political attention. So sure, we start with a good analysis and transparency, but we're going to have to shift this debate out of Geneva if we're going to get anywhere.
Thank you very much, George. And let me turn now to Alejandro Jara.
Thank you, John. It's a terrific panel. Congratulations to all. I've learned a great deal. Two points I want to make, and I apologize that they have been made, but I had some connection problems, so I missed part of the interventions. One point about transparency, we all agree that it's absolutely necessary. And I believe in thinking into the future that if you're going to have a transparency system based on notifications, by governments, you will get nowhere. Particularly when you design transparency obligations on the basis of their impact. For example, Article 3.3 of the Services Agreement says that members shall notify new or any changes to existing laws which significantly affect trade and services, When you reach that threshold, nobody knows, and thus no one notifies, nothing. So the portal, Anabel has mentioned, it's going to be launched in a month's time, is a very welcome instrument that should provide most of the data that should be used in thinking about future improvements to the system. And my second point is that perhaps we should use the example of the TBT and SPS agreements and establish a system whereby, as in a particular jurisdiction, a subsidy is being discussed by the executive and a respective parliament, that notifications should be made of the draft laws, so forth, to the members, and to provide a time for discussion, and to provide a procedure whereby any stakeholders can place their opinion or concerns with the relevant government authority. But this can give some opportunity for members to react and ask questions, and to put across to the member that is intending to apply a subsidy about its concerns of such a measure. And that, I think, could also be a way to start to improve the deliberative function of the WTO and to anticipate problems and to avoid disputes. Thank you, and once again, congratulations.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Jara. And now, let me go back to our panel and see if any of you would like to react to what's been said up to this point. Anabel, it looks to me like you might be ready to say something, and a number of people have referred to the work of the four organizations and the value of the portal and so forth. So if you would like to intervene, I think it'd be appropriate to do so now.
Thank you very much, John, and thanks to everyone for your comments and suggestions. And I think that the suggestions for increased transparency and involving others in this effort are very well taken. I think that as we've discussed that within the context of the four organizations, we are going to start with the information that is available. Each one of us has a lot of information, and not necessarily all members are aware, or I would say those in the trade community are not necessarily aware of, for example, what is available in under Article 4 consultations at the IMF, for example. So it is important to bring all this body of information in one site so that trade delegates or other stakeholders that are interested can get what I would say is a full picture of what is already available. But I do take the point that this is not enough. And the organizations have been discussing what more can be done, both within each of the organizations or the four working collectively, but also leveraging the efforts that are being done outside of the four organizations in the academic community, in the private sector. We know some very good initiatives out there. We all know the great work that Simon is doing in this area. So what I would like to think that the first objective right now is to take off this initiative of the portal off the ground. And it may sound like a simple thing, but I have to say that when we're all working together, it does take a bit of time. But once we get this off the ground, I think we will be looking at ways of improving it. And the points that you have mentioned here are, as I said, well taken. And particularly when you see it, once it's out there, all suggestions or comments are very much welcome.
Thank you very much, Anabel. Patrick, you have the floor.
Thank you, John. I think I wanted to just make a couple of comments. I think the work that's been done by the four agencies is great, but it still begs the question of where governments are, because governments are going to have to make the decisions. I don't think actually that it may well be, but judging on past realities, not to try to start in the WTO, start somewhere else, but get governments engaged. Try to lessen the degree of geoeconomics and geopolitics that leads to this zero-sum thinking, and recognize that cooperation could actually have benefits for everybody, including the developing countries. And I also completely buy the idea that let's start with rulemaking. Rulemaking comes after. Getting a handle on what needs to be done and what that would take from governments would come first. And on transparency, my proposal is that the government's free to let Simon Evernet loose, and the gap in the GATT WTO format for reporting subsidies, and then compare it with what governments do report. That could be quite an interesting exercise. Jonathan mentioned the structure of the SCM agreement. I completely agree with that. And there's another part to that, I think, which is that with so much vertical integration of production, with value chains both within and across borders, there's an awful lot of stuff that goes on which we're simply not capturing, especially in the field of services, which are more and more a core source of value. So I think that's a point that really deserves much more careful consideration than it gets. There are many developing countries. I've just been in Southeast Asia doing some work for ITC, and they're all doing this thing called Industry 4.0. It's a really important transformational issue, and it's mostly to do with digital, but green creeps in there too. And you can even begin to see this going on in Africa. I think this is a tremendous opportunity for countries to get together and see what ways there are of actually supporting this. And anything that involves cooperation rather than reaction to the concern that somebody's getting something at somebody else's expense would be a huge step forward. Thank you. Not hearing, John. Not hearing anything.
Simon, I think perhaps we could ask you to speak, because your name and your institution has been invoked a number of times so far in the discussion. And after Patrick, I'm going to ask Gabrielle Marceau if she would like to say something, because I understand she is in the audio audience and would like to make a comment. So, Simon.
Thank you, John. And I think this has been a great discussion, and I've learned a lot. I too am looking forward to this launch of the portal by the 4 IOs, and I think this will be a big step forward, connecting lots of different information sources together. I'd like to just make 2 comments. One is, I think listing these different sources will be great. I think even more useful is if it is possible to be able to link each subsidy intervention to the relevant sector codes and HS codes when we're talking about trade in products. And I think that becomes, that then facilitates the type of research on the scale of the trade affected and alike, and will help people scale this problem a lot better. We found that when we started working on this, that question, we literally had to build an application to be able to identify with particular firms that have received subsidies, which products they produce and trade. And so there's actually quite a serious investment there, I think, needed to be able to correctly identify HS codes to relevant corporate, firm-specific corporate subsidies. But that's a challenge we can all work through and talk about as well. The second comment is just to say that I'll be looking forward to the launch of the portal in I think April, and in May at the Hexaline conference being organised by the Swedish government, we'll be releasing our updated subsidy inventory, which will include subsidy interventions not just by the EU, China, and the United States, but by all governments that we have collected. And just to give you a sense about that, I just spoke with our monitoring team head, and she says we're documenting 70 to 80 new subsidy interventions per week. So this gives you a sense of what's coming through the pipeline. I thought that might be useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. That is useful. I must say I have some lingering hope in the back of my mind that governments may be prepared to act when they realize they have no money left and are going to have to figure out how to cut back their expenditures. And I think here the comment made by John Fried about the work on steel and the idea of ratcheting down may be something that will become not a desirable policy alternative, not just, but a requirement imposed by the fiscal constraints and the bankers on the ability of governments to continue to spend, not to mention their own domestic political constituencies where the battle seems to be shifting. So Gabrielle, over to you. Oh, and after Gabrielle speaks, we're down in our last 5 minutes. So I will give the floor back after that to Ambassador Pitfield and Ambassador Machado if they have any concluding remarks that they would like to make. So Gabrielle, you have the floor.
Thank you, John. My question is more for the Economist, and it's about equivalences and whether, I'm candid, but whether there's a need or room for economists to start comparing actions. Everybody's talking about financial subsidies, but Anabel mentioned, and at the beginning in the presentations, we know that at least conceptually, regulations can also constitute a subsidy. And when countries fight, they will start comparing their actions. And for instance, on CBAM at the moment, governments are starting to compare their actions. Is there room or a need for comparing governmental actions that would be equivalent to subsidies or be subsidies in order to be able to really compare actions? Because it's much more in the SCM, we require financial contribution and specificity. But I remember a discussion with OECD economists saying that even specificity may not be necessary to have a subsidy. So this is just a question. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Gabrielle. Now, Ambassador Pitfield, Ambassador Machado, do either of you, would you like to make some concluding remarks? Go ahead.
I give it to my more senior counterpart. No, sorry. Joe, you want to go first?
Well,
they're so polite. We're going to run out of time.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's been very useful. It's a start, but a very needed start. I think there is a lot of interest in having and starting a discussion and a deliberation on these questions of subsidies, because many governments are using it. And as I said in the beginning, I'm afraid this is here to stay. And we need to engage in this in the WTO. Now we need to move quickly as much as possible to start having this discussion inside the house, because otherwise it goes elsewhere. And as we have seen on other areas, it's a pity that it's not WTO that discussed, but it will be migrating somewhere else. So I really hope that we can build consensus to have it much needed. And we need to have this debate addressing different issues, different forms of state intervention, as I said, but is necessary. If we want to have the trading system and the WTO system relevant, we need to address this, which is one of the challenges, and how this relates to the climate transition and the digital transition and development more generally. So thanks very much, very useful. And I see that you outlined already possible new topics related to this, so I will be very keen to follow that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, João. And Ambassador Pitfield.
Yes, thank you very much, John. I'll go very quickly. I think there was one point that I wanted to say, but I didn't have time, which is that I'm glad that I see the debate on this important issue is taking off in various points at the WTO, among WTO. But we cannot only look at the existing subsidies agreement on ASCM or agriculture only, because even though we are maybe thinking of revising the green box for agriculture, or the having non-actionable subsidies being brought back to life again, we have to look at the horizontal issues as well. I'm saying this because, like, if we look at agriculture subsidy, but we also talk about climate change, we have to think about these things together. Otherwise, we will have double subsidies, you know. So the things are interconnected, and so I would like it not to be discussed only among subsidies debate. That is my only point. And same with innovation or digital, you know, this is about intellectual property as well, but it is also about other aspects in the WTO. So maybe I don't have answer for Ambassador Machado's question of where, but I'm glad that at least it is starting. My final point, if I want to thank you, an organizer, but I also specifically thanks Professor Everett Simon for all the contribution in not only this work, but a lot of stuff at the Thai mission. We use a lot of information from your institute. So I hope that you will be working with WTO members and the institution in the years to come. Thank you so much for your contribution. So that's my final point.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And well, we've reached the end of our time, but I'd like to thank our four panelists very much for their excellent contributions. And I'd like to thank everyone else who intervened in today's discussion with their thoughts and contributions. And I'd like to thank all those who merely tuned in to listen to what was being said. As I mentioned in my introduction, we will be sitting down virtually in the Friends of Multilateralism Group to think about whether we should be taking further steps. And I think from what I've heard so far today that it seems that such further steps would be welcome. So we may well be organizing additional discussions in the months ahead. But I won't say anything further about that now until I've been able to hear the views of other members of the group and let the executive of the organization decide on how we should best proceed. But thank you very much. For those of you who are about to enter the evening, good afternoon, good late morning, etc., or good night. Thank you very much for your attention. Bye-bye.